um, Kirsten Axelsen. Hopefully I'm not mispronouncing that too poorly here. But Kristen's going to take us to talk a little bit more around investment and funding decisions. Kristen is from the American Enterprise Institute, where she's responsible for strategy. Where she's a visiting scholar with the Institute and an Aspen Institute Health Innovator Fellow. So, Kirsten, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the other speakers. I think Cronus and I are going to share many similar perspectives, so it was nice to get to listen to him first, and I'll build on some of the comments he made. My name is Kirsten Axelsen. I am an independent consultant in addition to being a visiting scholar with the American Enterprise Institute, senior advisor to Charles River Associates, as well as DLA Piper. Prior to that, I spent 19 years in industry working on policy, business strategy, and business development analytics, where we confronted exactly this question. What are the types of investments that should be made in developing different drugs or in seeking out different types of partnerships through acquisition or co-promotion? You know, when considering what drugs to invest in, what drugs to develop, which drugs to invest in more for additional indications, it's pretty simple and not surprising to anyone that the cost or the likely benefit of developing that drug for that particular disease is a key factor, as well as the market size. And when we compare how the cost of developing a drug relative to its likely ability to be approved and achieve benefit in patient populations for drugs such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, mental health, relative to drugs like cancer, it's not surprising that you see far more drugs being developed for cancer relative to all those chronic diseases. In 2020, there were 1,300 drugs in development for cancer, 200 medicines in development for CVD as of 2018. And this is not commensurate with the burden of those diseases in the population. You know, the combined burden of the CVD, diabetes, and stroke far outweigh the number of deaths from cancer. Although deaths from cancer in the United States and around the world are there are far too many. And it's not to say that investment and the survival gains we've seen in cancer are to be discredited. You know, part of the reason why it's harder, more expensive to develop a drug for cardiovascular disease is because it takes longer to have an event, and we haven't seen the same investment in basic science that you've seen with cancer, where there's been subpopulation prioritization, ability to target specific genes. We haven't seen the same targeting in cancer. And in fact, the investment in basic research at the NIH is 2 times the amount for cancer that it is for cardiovascular disease and diabetes. You know, we know that chronic diseases are affected by environmental factors as well as genes. I already discussed the lack of investment and progress made in genotyping. But then we also haven't developed many standardized metrics for environmental factors. Outside of smoking and BMI, we haven't really developed a number of standardized tools that could say, this is a target, this is an environmental target that could be studied in a clinical trial and a drug developed specifically for this environmental target. Now, going on to the reimbursement side, there are a number of factors creating headwinds for chronic disease. One is chronic diseases tend to over-index in low-income and minority populations, who tend to be the patients who get the lowest, we pay the least for treating those patients. They are often the hardest to treat with the most complex diseases, but often in Medicaid or in primary care providers, where non-Medicaid and also specialist providers, including oncologists, typically receive higher reimbursement. Too often, minority and low-income patients aren't referred up to specialists like cardiologists who could potentially identify and treat their specific conditions. In addition, there's a number of comorbidities typically present in chronic disease. And again, the sort of the appropriate medicine to treat a patient with multiple chronic conditions. Again, we don't have the standardized tools there. And often when recruiting patients for clinical trials, you want to choose the patient who has the least complicating factors to have the cleanest and best outcome to be able to present the case most credibly to the regulator. And so that will often mean excluding the patients who have multiple comorbidities and other conditions that could be affecting their health. Where we have seen innovation in chronic disease is particularly in the area of gene therapy. While there are a number of gene therapies approved for cancers, there's also gene therapies approved for chronic conditions, as well as investment in gene therapies for chronic conditions such as hemophilia, sickle cell disease. Those therapies, again, would tend to be a more dramatic improvement relative to what we sort of typically think of as a chronic disease treatment, which is one that sort of abates the symptoms. I think as was raised earlier, we also we have a cost problem, both cost to the patients and cost to the healthcare system. If we have a number of new therapies developed targeted for chronic diseases and they follow the same cost model as is seen in oncology, we'll have proliferation of high cost therapies and a health system that may be unable to support the payment for those high cost therapies. There again, I think part of what we need to do is look to the very broad array of low cost therapies that are available to treat chronic disease in statins and in antihypertensive drugs. Even though those drugs are largely generic, adherence is still abysmal. Typically 50% or more of patients drop off after 6 months. And that adherence rate has not changed much with the availability of low-cost generics. There needs to be more investment into understanding what behavioral, what financial incentives can encourage and support adherence. And those incentives may be in the form of insurance design, but we also know that when the patient is more comfortable with the provider, including having a similar race as the provider, a provider who has the time and ability to connect with them, that increases their adherence. So adherence goes beyond just the typical traditional tools we think of, like copay and digital reminders. So with that, I'll just cite the recent example of success in rapid development of medicines for conditions that didn't exist before. And of course, that's a very well discussed multiple vaccines for COVID. There has long been a well-recognized issue that there are not the right incentives there for antibiotic development and anti-infective development. We saw a confluence of exactly what I mentioned you need for rapid drug development, which is the belief that the market size exists, that there will be a reimbursable pathway for the medicine, and also a lower cost to outcome ratio, which we saw with significant willingness to have regulatory flexibility for approval of the new vaccine, and then governments willing around the world to pay for it. So I'll pass it over to the next speaker with that.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. It's a good flow of themes here that I think are kind of starting to culminate, that I'll look forward to the panel discussion to kind of flesh out, and maybe some of our guests online will be sending in questions that we can address during the panel discussion.